Every night, Marcus heard the same thing, whispers rising from the forest. Not words, not language, just voices. Hundreds of them, tangled in the wind, calling from between the trees that bordered his land. At first he told himself it was nothing, the echo of wind through hollow trunks. But on the seventh night, the voices stopped. The forest went still. And from that silence, something moved. A wolf stepped out of the shadows, huge, black as ash. Its eyes glowed gold beneath the moonlight, and in its jaws it carried a doll, not a toy any child should own. The fabric was ancient. The button eyes cracked, and around it frost spread through the grass like veins of ice. The wolf dropped it at his feet and waited. Marcus remembered his grandfather's last words, "If something comes out of the forest, don't turn it away," so he picked it up. Instantly he felt it, grief, terror, longing, as if 100 voices screamed through his bones. The doll was cold, impossibly cold, but alive with something that wanted to be found. That night, the voices returned softer, almost thankful, and from then on, the wolf came every evening, carrying objects no living thing should hold. Now Marcus knows the forest doesn't forget its dead, it remembers everything, and some memories refuse to stay buried. Question for you: if a wolf brought something to your doorstep, would you take it inside? The first time Marcus heard the voices, he convinced himself it was the wind playing tricks through the hollow trunks of the dead elms at the forest's edge. It was a sound like whispering, soft, urgent, countless, rising from the tree line that bordered his property on 3 sides. He stood on his porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring into the darkness beyond his fields, and listened. The voices came every night after that. Marcus had inherited the farm from his grandfather 8 months ago, along with the sagging barn, the modest house with its creaking floors, and 200 acres that stretched back into woods so old they predated the county records. His grandfather had been a silent man, given to long stares and longer silences, and in his final days, he'd gripped Marcus's wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't go into the forest after dark, and if something comes out, don't turn it away." At the time, Marcus had attributed the warning to delirium. Now, standing in the October cold with his breath misting before him, he wasn't so sure. The voices never resolved into words he could understand. They were more like the memory of conversation, the cadence and rhythm of speech without the substance. Sometimes they sounded urgent, tumbling over each other in their haste. Other times they were mournful, a keening that made his chest tighten with an inexplicable grief. He began to recognize patterns arise and fall that suggested questions and answers, pauses that felt like listening. Marcus told no one. In town he was already the city boy who inherited the old Hartley place, viewed with the gentle skepticism reserved for outsiders, who thought they could make a go of rural life. Mentioning phantom voices in the forest would only confirm their suspicions that he didn't belong, so he kept his vigils private, standing on the porch each evening as twilight bled into night, waiting for the voices to begin. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that he should go inside, lock the door, and sleep soundly like a rational person. But something kept him there, night after night, listening to the incomprehensible chorus rising from the trees. It was on the 7th night that he first saw movement. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across his fallow fields and illuminate the edge of the forest in silver gray. The voices had been particularly loud that evening, almost agitated, and Marcus had moved from the porch to the middle of his yard, drawn forward by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. That's when he saw Ita's shape emerging from between 2 ancient oaks, moving with a gait that was unmistakably animal. A wolf, but not like any wolf Marcus had seen in books or documentaries. This creature was enormous, easily the size of a small bear, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Its eyes caught the light and threw it back in shades of amber and gold, and it was carrying something in its mouth. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get inside, to put walls and locked doors between himself and this impossible creature. But he stood frozen, watching as the wolf approached with slow, deliberate steps. It stopped at the boundary where his mowed lawn met the wild grass of the fields. A demarcation Marcus maintained more out of habit than necessity. The wolf lowered its massive head and gently placed its burden on the ground. Then it sat, regarding Marcus with those luminous eyes, and waited. The voices in the forest had gone completely silent. Marcus's legs felt like water, but he forced himself to take a step forward, then another. The wolf didn't move, didn't growl or bare its teeth. It simply watched him with an expression that seemed almost ... expectant. When Marcus was close enough to see what the wolf had brought, his breath caught in his throat. It was a dollar child's toy, handmade from cloth and stuffing, with button eyes and yarn hair. But that wasn't what made Marcus's skin prickle with unease. The doll was ancient, the fabric weathered and stained, and it radiated a cold that had nothing to do with the October air. As Marcus stared at it, he could swear he saw frost forming on the grass around it, spreading outward in delicate crystalline patterns. The wolf made a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something that vibrated in Marcus's bones and made his teeth ache. It nudged the doll toward him with its nose, then looked up at him again with those golden eyes. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory. If something comes out, don't turn it away. With trembling hands, Marcus bent down and picked up the doll. The cold that emanated from it was shocking, painful, like grabbing a piece of metal that had been stored in a freezer. But beneath the cold was something else, a vibration, a hum he could feel rather than hear. And with it came emotions that weren't his own. Grief, longing, a desperate aching need to be found. The wolf stood, and for a moment Marcus was certain it would attack him now that he'd taken what it offered. But instead, it simply turned and padded back toward the forest. At the tree line, it paused and looked back at him one last time. Then it vanished into the shadows as silently as it had emerged. Marcus stood in his yard holding the impossible doll, his entire body shaking. The voices had started again, but now they sounded different, relieved, almost grateful. He looked down at the thing in his hands, at its button eyes that seemed to stare up at him with mute appeal, and wondered what in God's name he was supposed to do with it. He brought it inside. The rest of the night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the doll in front of him, too shaken to sleep. He'd placed it on a dish towel, and the cold radiating from it had frosted the fabric white. He'd tried to research similar experiences on his laptop, wolves bringing offerings, haunted objects, strange occurrences in forests, but everything he found was either obvious fiction or did a match what he'd experienced. As dawn broke and the first light crept through his windows, the doll's coldness began to fade. By the time the sun had fully risen, it felt like nothing more than an old toy, the kind you might find in an antique store or a dusty attic. But Marcus knew better. He'd felt what lived inside. It, if lived was even the right word. He placed it on the mantel above his fireplace, unable to bring himself to throw it away. Something about that felt wrong, almost cruel, like abandoning a child. All day, as he went about his chores, fixing a fence, checking the barn's roof for leaks, clearing debris from the drainage ditches, he was aware of it sitting there, waiting. That evening, he stood on his porch again as the sun set. The voices began right on schedule, rising from the forest in their incomprehensible chorus. And as darkness fell complete, Marcus saw the wolf emerge once more from the trees. It was carrying something else. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Each night, the wolf would come, bearing objects that no living thing should carry. A rusted pocket watch that ticked backward, counting down to some unknown zero. A child's shoe so small it could only have belonged to a toddler, filled with teeth that were definitely not human. A photograph in a cracked frame showing a family Marcus didn't recognize, except the image slowly changed if you watched it long enough, the smiles fading to screams. A music box that played a melody Marcus had never heard but somehow knew had been lost for 100 years. A leather journal filled with writing that shifted between languages, some of which Marcus was certain had been dead for centuries. Each object was impossibly cold. Each one hummed with that same bone-deep vibration, carrying emotions and fragmentary images that weren't quite memories and weren't quite dreams. And each one, Marcus understood with growing certainty, was connected to someone who had been lost, not just misplaced, but fundamentally lost in ways that defied natural explanation. He arranged them on his mantel, then on shelves. When the mantel filled, his living room became a gallery of the impossible, each piece radiating its cold presence even as they seemed to draw comfort from proximity to each other. The house grew colder as the collection expanded, his breath visible even indoors. Frost patterns crawling across the windows in geometric designs that looked almost like writing. The voices in the forest changed too. Each night, after the wolf made its delivery, the chorus would shift slightly, becoming less urgent, more settled, as if some small piece of an infinite puzzle had clicked into place. Marcus began to distinguish individual voices from the multitude, recognizing tones and patterns. Some were children, some were old beyond measure. All of them carried the weight of stories that had been interrupted, lives that had been cut short or cut off or simply lost their way back to the world of the living. Marcus tried to research his grandfather's history, looking for clues about what he'd known and why he'd warned Marcus but never explained. He found records of the Hartley family going back 6 generations, all living on this same land, all inheriting it from father to son. But there were gaps in the records, missing years, absent family members who vanished from documents with no explanation. And in the oldest records, from the 1800s, he found a reference to the keeper in a county historical document, though the context had been lost to water damage and age. In town, Marcus began to notice things he'd missed before. The way conversations would pause when he entered the general store, then resume with slightly forced normalcy. The sideways glances from older residents, the time Mrs. Kemper, who ran the diner, had asked him how he was getting on with the house, with an emphasis that suggested she was asking about more than the plumbing and roof. One evening, as he was leaving the hardware store with supplies to repair his barn door, he was stopped by an old man he'd never seen before. The stranger had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, his face creased with lines that spoke of sun and wind and years. "You're Hartley's grandson," the old man said. It wasn't a question. "I am Marcus Hartley." The old man nodded slowly, studying Marcus with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Your grandfather was a good man, a quiet man, but good. He knew his duty. What duty? Marcus asked, his pulse quickening, but the old man just shook his head. You'll figure it out. Or you won't, and someone else will have to take it on. That's how these things go. He started to walk away, then paused. The forest remembers everything, son, everything, and sometimes, what it remembers needs a place to rest until it can be properly laid down. Your grandfather understood that. I hope you will too. Before Marcus could ask what he meant, the old man had disappeared around the corner. That night, the wolf brought a wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth with age, and when Marcus picked it up, he was hit with such a powerful wave of love and loss that he actually staggered backward. He saw flashes, not quite visions, not quite memories of a young couple, a marriage during wartime, a promise to return that was never kept. The ring had been lost in the forest in 1943, dropped from fingers that would never slip it back on, and it had been waiting ever since to be found, to have its story acknowledged. Marcus placed it with the others and stood looking at his strange collection. 43 objects now, each one a fragment of an interrupted story. A life that had brushed against the forest and left something behind, not always physically, but spiritually, emotionally, in ways that bound them to this place. He understood now, or thought he did. The forest was old, so old that it had accumulated the weight of everything that had happened within it or near it, every death, every tragedy, every moment of profound loss or longing. These things couldn't simply disappear. They persisted, caught between the world of the living and whatever came after, unable to move forward or back. They became part of the forest itself, their voices joining the chorus that rose each night from between the trees. And the wolf, the wolf was their messenger, their advocate, their bridge to the world beyond the trees. But why, and why Marcus? Why his family? Generation after generation. He didn't have answers yet, but as he stood there, surrounded by objects that glowed with cold light in his darkened living room, listening to the voices singing their incomprehensible songs, Marcus knew he was about to find out. The wolf was sitting on his lawn, visible through the window. It was watching the house, patient and eternal. And for the first time since this had all begun, Marcus saw that it wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the forest behind it, shadows that were darker than the darkness around them, human-shaped but not quite human, drawn by the objects Marcus had collected, pulled by the gravity of their own lost pieces. They were coming closer, and Marcus realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling his house that this was only the beginning. The wolf had brought him the objects, yes, but the objects had brought something else. The dead were coming to reclaim what was theirs. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He couldn't tear his eyes from the window, watching the shapes that gathered at the forest's edge. They didn't cross into his yard, not yet, but they were there. Dozens of them now, standing motionless among the trees. Human silhouettes rendered in shadow, some tall, some small, some bent with age or injury. Waiting, the wolf remained on the lawn, a dark sentinel between the house and the forest, between Marcus and whatever those shadows represented. Its golden eyes reflected the light from his windows, unblinking, patient. As the first gray light of dawn began to soften the darkness, the shadows faded like mist under the sun. The wolf stood, shook itself in a strangely dog-like gesture, and melted back into the forest. Marcus watched until the last trace of it vanished, then finally allowed himself to collapse into the chair by the window. Exhausted but too wired with adrenaline to truly rest, he spent the day trying to understand what he'd seen. The objects on his shelves hummed quietly in the daylight, their cold presence muted but not gone. He moved among them, touching each one carefully, trying to make sense of the fragmentary impressions they gave him. Each touch brought flashes, moments frozen in time, emotions preserved like insects in amber. The pocket watch had belonged to a railroad man named Thomas Garrett, who died in 1889 when his train derailed in a storm. He'd been thrown into the forest, his body never recovered, and his watch had been found 3 days later by his son, still ticking despite being submerged in a creek. The watch had stopped the day his son died, 40 years later, and had been running backward ever since. The child's shoe with its cargo of teeth had a darker story, a girl named Sarah who'd gotten lost in the forest in 1952 during a family picnic. Search parties had looked for weeks. They'd found the shoe but never found Sarah. The teeth were from the search dogs that had tried to track her. Dogs that had gone mad one by one over the following months, their teeth falling out as they howled at the forest every night until they died. Each object was a tragedy, a mystery, a wound in the fabric of what should have been. And Marcus was beginning to understand that his house, his grandfather's house, the Hartley house, going back generations, was serving as a kind of museum, archive, sanctuary. He found his grandfather's journals in the attic that afternoon, buried beneath old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. There were dozens of them, spanning 40 years. Written in his grandfather's cramped, careful handwriting. Marcus brought them down and began to read. June 15, 1985, the wolf came again tonight. Brought a compass this time, brass and green with age. I felt the sailor's last moments when I touched it, the cold water, the darkness, the certainty that he would never see home again. Placed it with the others. The voices seem quieter when I do this, like whatever remains of these people finds some peace in being acknowledged. Father was right. This is our duty. This is why the Hartleys have always lived on this land. September 3rd, 1987, a woman from town asked me today if I ever hear strange things from the forest. Mrs. Kemper's niece, visiting from Portland. I told her it was just the wind. She looked at me like she knew I was lying but didn't blame me for it. The town knows. They've always known. But no one speaks of it directly. It's like we've all agreed to maintain a collective fiction, even as we all live with the truth. October 29, 1993, the collection has grown so large I've had to store some pieces in the cellar. Sarah's shoe, the teeth, I couldn't bear to look at them anymore, but I couldn't get rid of them either. Father told me that once. Years ago, a Hartley tried to throw the objects away, buried them, burned them, tossed them in the river. They all came back. The forest returns what belongs to it. We can only hold these things in trust until what? Father never knew. His father never knew. How far back does this go? And what happens when there's no one left to receive what the wolf brings? November 15, 2003, I saw them tonight, the shadows. They've never come so close before, never been so bold. They stood at the very edge of the lawn, almost solid in the moonlight. I could make out faces, old faces, young faces, faces twisted with anguish or slack with the patience of the eternally waiting. The wolf stood between us, as always, protecting me, protecting them, both. I realize I've been doing this for 35 years and I still don't understand the rules. I only know that it must be done. January 8, 2015, I'm dying. The doctor confirmed it today. Cancer, spreading too fast to stop. I have maybe a year. I need to prepare Marcus, but how do you prepare someone for this? How do you explain that our family is bound to serve as keepers for the lost? Witnesses to tragedies that refuse to be forgotten. Guardians of a boundary between the living and the dead that exists nowhere else but in this forest, on this land. He's a good boy, smart, but he's lived in cities his whole life. He doesn't believe in things like this. How could he? March 3rd, 2024. Last entry. I can barely hold the pen now. Marcus came to visit. I tried to warn him, but the words wouldn't come out right. The morphine makes everything fuzzy. I told him not to go in the forest at night. I told him not to turn away what comes out. It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough, but it's all I have left to give. The wolf was in my room last night. No, the nurses didn't see it, couldn't see it. It laid its head on my bed and looked at me with those ancient eyes. I think it was saying goodbye. I think it was saying thank you. I think it was saying the duty passes now. God forgive me, Marcus. I'm leaving you this burden. I'm leaving you to face what I barely understood. But someone has to do it. Someone always has. The forest remembers everything. And the dead need witnesses. Marcus closed the journal, his hands shaking. The date of that last entry was 2 weeks before his grandfather died. He'd been in that hospital room sitting beside the bed, watching the old man slip away. He'd thought his grandfather was delirious near the end, rambling about wolves and voices and duty. He'd held his hand and promised that everything would be okay, the kind of comfortable lie you tell the dying. He understood now that his grandfather had been trying to prepare him in the only way the morphine and cancer would allow. The sun was setting again. Through the window, Marcus could see the forest darkening, shadows deepening between the trees. The voices would start soon. The wolf would come. And tonight, perhaps, those shadows would be bolder still. He thought about running. He could pack a bag, get in his truck and drive away from this place and never come back. Let the farm fall to ruin. Let the forest reclaim the land. Let someone else, if there was anyone else, stake on this impossible, thankless duty. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't do it. Maybe it was family obligation. Maybe it was something deeper, something in his blood that had been passed down through 6 generations of Hartleys who had stood in this very spot, making this same choice. Or maybe it was simpler than that. The objects on his shelves represented people, lost people, forgotten people, people whose stories had been interrupted and who, for whatever reason, couldn't move on until those stories were somehow acknowledged, witnessed, remembered. To abandon them felt like a cruelty Marcus couldn't commit. He thought about Sarah, the little girl lost in 1952. She'd be over 70 now if she'd lived, but part of her was still here, still lost, still waiting in the cold darkness between the trees. The shoe with its burden of madness was all that remained of her interrupted life. It was so little. But it was something to throw it away. To refuse it would be to say that her loss didn't matter, that she didn't matter. And that, Marcus realized, was what the Hartleys had been doing all along. Not solving mysteries or putting ghosts to rest, those things were beyond human power. But witnessing, acknowledging, saying to the lost and the dead, I see what happened to you. I recognize your loss. You are not forgotten. It was such a small thing, but perhaps, in the face of death and tragedy and the vast indifference of time, small things were all anyone could offer. As night fell complete, the voices began. Marcus stepped out onto his porch, his breath misting in air that had grown prematurely cold. The wolf emerged from the forest, and even from a distance, Marcus could see it was carrying something larger tonight, something that required both care and effort. It crossed the lawn and laid its burden at Marcus's feet, then sat back, waiting. Marcus knelt down and found himself looking at a teddy bear, ancient and worn, missing one eye and much of its fur. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that the bear was wrapped in a child's blanket, and both bear and blanket were stained with something dark that Marcus's mind identified immediately as blood, despite the passage of what must have been decades. When he touched it, the cold was so intense it burned, and the emotions that flooded through him were so powerful, so concentrated, that Marcus actually cried out. Terror, pain, confusion, a child's voice calling for its mother, darkness, cold, and then after what felt like an eternity of suffering, a strange soft warmth, acceptance, the peaceful drift into whatever came next. But the bear remained behind, soaked with the blood and fear and love that had surrounded those final moments. It had remained unable to follow where the child had gone, trapped in the endless loop of that terrible night. Marcus's hands shook as he carefully picked up the bear and its blanket. Behind the wolf, the shadows had moved forward. They were on the lawn now, standing in a semicircle around the porch. He could see their faces clearly in the moonlight, or rather, where their faces should have been were suggestions of features, memory of what they had looked like when they lived. One shadow stood closer than the others, small, child-sized, and as Marcus watched, reached out toward the bear in his hands with something like yearning. The wolf made that sound again, that not quite whine, not quite growl that vibrated in Marcus's bones. Then it stood and walked to the shadow child, standing beside it, in a posture that could only be called protective. Marcus understood. The objects weren't just fragments of stories, they were anchors, chains, weights that held the dead in place, preventing them from moving on to whatever came after death. And by collecting them, by bringing them together, by acknowledging them, Marcus was somehow, loosening those chains, gathering them all in one place where they could finally be laid down. He looked at the bear in his hands, at the shadow child that had once held it, and made a decision. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry you were afraid. I'm sorry no one could help you. I'm sorry you've been waiting so long." The words felt inadequate, insufficient, like trying to heal a severed limb with a band-aid, but the shadow child seemed to brighten slightly, becoming more distinct, more present. And around it, the other shadows pressed closer, listening. Marcus realized they were all waiting for the same thing: recognition, acknowledgement, someone to witness their loss and name it for what it was, a tragedy, an injustice, a wound in the world that had never properly healed. So he spoke to them. One by one, he picked up the objects from his mantle and his shelves, brought them out onto the porch, and told the stories he'd gleaned from them. The railroad man and his backward-ticking watch, Sarah and her shoe full of madness, the sailor and his compass, the soldier and his letters, the woman and her ring. Each object had a story, incomplete and fragmentary, but real. He spoke until his voice was hoarse, until the moon had traveled across half the sky, until the cold had seeped so deep into his bones that he could barely feel his hands anymore. And as he spoke, the shadows listened. Some of them began to fade, not disappearing, but becoming softer, less defined, as if the weight of waiting was finally lifting from them. The wolf sat throughout it all, patient and eternal, its golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. And when Marcus had finally acknowledged every object, every story, every lost soul that had left its mark on the forest, the wolf stood and walked to him. This time Marcus didn't flinch. He reached out and laid his hand on the wolf's massive head. The fur was impossibly soft and impossibly cold, and beneath his palm, Marcus could feel the same vibration he'd felt in the objects, but older, deeper, vaster. This creature was old beyond measure, bound to the forest by ties that predated human habitation, maybe predated humanity itself. It was the forest's guardian and its messenger, the keeper of its memories, the shepherd of its lost, and the Hartleys, Marcus understood, were its partners in that eternal duty. The wolf pressed its head against Marcus's hand for a moment, a gesture that felt like gratitude, like acknowledgement, like the passing of a covenant. Then it turned and walked back toward the forest. The shadows went with it, following in a silent procession, leaving Marcus alone on his porch with his collection of the lost and the knowledge that this was now his life's work. The seasons turned, and Marcus's collection grew. Autumn faded to winter, winter to spring, spring to summer, and each night brought new treasures of sorrow. The wolf came reliably, a constant in Marcus's transformed life, bringing objects that ranged from the mundane to the inexplicable, a harmonica that played itself at midnight, always the same mournful tune, a glass marble that contained what looked like a frozen tear, a piece of rope that had been used to save a life, then later to end one, a letter that had never been delivered, the paper so old it was nearly transparent, the words faded but still readable: "I forgive you. Come home." With each object came shadows, the remnants or memories or whatever they were of the people who had left these anchors behind. Marcus developed a routine. Each evening he would take the new object, hold it until he understood what fragments of story it contained, then add it to his collection. Then he would speak to the shadows, acknowledging their losses, witnessing their interrupted stories, offering the only comfort he could, the assurance that they were not forgotten. Sometimes the shadows faded after being witnessed. Sometimes they remained, but seemed lighter, less burdened. And sometimes, more rarely, they became more solid, more present, as if the acknowledgement gave them strength to manifest more fully in the world of the living. Marcus learned to distinguish between them. There were the faded shadows that had been waiting so long they'd almost lost their definition, barely human-shaped anymore, more like smoke or mist. There were the recent, sharper, more distinct, still clinging to the memory of flesh and bone and breath. And there were the bound, those who, for reasons Marcus didn't fully understand, couldn't leave even after their stories were acknowledged, tied to their anchors by chains of guilt or grief or unfinished business so powerful that even death couldn't sever them. The town's attitude toward him shifted as the months passed. He was no longer the city boy, but something else, something that didn't have an easy name. People nodded to him with a kind of grave respect when he came to town. Conversations didn't stop when he entered rooms, but they did change, becoming more careful, more deliberate. The older residents would sometimes approach him with stories not about themselves, but about others. A grandfather who'd disappeared in the forest in 1947. A sister who'd gone for a walk one evening in 1963 and never returned. A friend who'd driven into those woods drunk one night and been found dead, though the crash shouldn't have killed him. They never asked Marcus directly if he'd seen anything, if he'd received anything from the forest, but the hope in their eyes was unmistakable. They wanted to know that their lost ones were ... what? Remembered, that peace still somehow present in the world. Marcus couldn't always give them that comfort. Many of the objects he received predated living memory, reaching back to the 1800s or even earlier. But when he did have information, when an object's story matched one of the town's whispered histories, he would share what he knew as carefully as he could. Your grandfather's lighter. He might say, I have it. He was trying to get home during the blizzard of '47. He almost made it. He thought of your grandmother at the end. He thought of how she made coffee in the mornings. Small things, fragments, but in the faces of those who heard them, Marcus saw a kind of relief, as if confirmation of death, even tragic death, was better than the terrible uncertainty of absence. His house had changed too. The cold was constant now, even in summer, frost patterns permanent on the windows. The walls had begun to show strange marks, not quite writing, not quite pictures, but something in between. Impressions, echoes, the accumulated weight of all those stories, all those losses, leaving their mark on the physical space. Marcus had to start using the barn for additional storage. He'd cleaned it out, installed proper shelving, and created a kind of archive. Objects organized by date where possible, by type where not. Each one carefully labeled with what information he had. He'd started keeping his own journals too, following his grandfather's example, documenting each delivery, each story, each shadow that came to call. The wolf became his constant companion, or at least a constant presence. It didn't live at the house Marcus suspected. It didn't live anywhere in the conventional sense, but it was there most nights. Sitting on the lawn or the porch, watching the forest and the house with equal attention. Sometimes Marcus would talk to it, sharing his frustrations or fears or the small triumphs of the day. The wolf never responded in any way he could measure, but Marcus felt heard nonetheless. It was in the second year that things began to change more dramatically. Marcus woke one morning to find that one of the bound had come into his house. A woman more solid than any shadow he'd seen before, standing in his living room looking at the collection on his shelves. She turned when Marcus entered, and her face, still translucent, still not quite real, but recognizable, was streaked with tears that looked like rain on glass. My daughter's bear, she said, her voice like wind through empty rooms. You have my daughter's bear. Marcus recognized her immediately. She was the shadow that had been present that first night, the small one that had reached for the blood-stained teddy bear. But she'd grown more solid over the months, fed by his acknowledgments, strengthened by his witnessing. I do, Marcus said carefully. From 1968, a car accident on the old mountain road. The woman nodded. We were going to visit her grandmother. It was raining. The car went off the road. I tried to get her out, but the doors were jammed, and the water was rising so fast. She was holding that bear. She wouldn't let it go, even when her voice broke. That wind-through-room sound becoming a howl of anguish. I couldn't save her. I couldn't save my baby. I know, Marcus said softly. I felt it when I touched the bear. I'm so sorry. I've been here ever since, the woman continued, watching the road, waiting for her to call for me, but she never does. She moved on, didn't she? She's gone where I can't follow because I can't let go, because every night I hear her calling for me in those last moments. And I can't. She was dissolving, becoming less solid, her grief pulling her apart. Marcus acted on instinct. He went to the shelf, took down the bear, still cold, still heavy with the weight of that terrible night, and brought it to her. She called for you because she loved you, Marcus said. She was afraid, yes, but she wasn't alone. She knew you were there. She knew you were trying, and at the end, she felt warm. I felt that too. She felt warm and safe and loved. That was you. That warmth was you, even in the cold and the darkness. You saved her from dying alone and afraid. You gave her that. The shadow woman stared at him, then at the bear. Slowly, she reached out, and when her translucent fingers touched the worn fabric, something extraordinary happened. The cold in the room intensified until Marcus's breath turned to ice crystals in the air. The frost on the windows grew thicker, creeping up the walls, and the bear began to glow, not with light but with the absence of light, a darkness so profound it seemed to pull at the edges of Marcus's vision. Then, slowly, the glow faded, the cold diminished, and the bear in Marcus's hands no longer felt heavy with grief and trauma. It was just a barreled, worn, loved once, but now just a toy without the weight of tragedy anchoring it to this world. The shadow woman was changing too. She was becoming more solid, more real, but also more translucent, as if solidity and transparency could somehow coexist. Her face was clear now, a young woman, maybe 30 when she died, with kind eyes and the permanent exhaustion of motherhood. She was smiling. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for holding this for her. For holding this for me. I can go now. I can finally go find her." And she did. She didn't fade or dissolve or vanish. She simply left, walked toward the wall and through it. Not like a ghost passing through solid matter, but like someone stepping through a door that Marcus couldn't see but that had always been there, waiting for her to be ready to use it. Marcus stood in his living room, holding a teddy bear that was now just a teddy bear, and understood this was the purpose. Not just to collect and acknowledge, but to somehow free these objects from the weight they carried. To release the dead from their anchors so they could finally move on. But he didn't know how he'd done it. He'd just spoken the truth as he'd felt it in the object. Was that all it took? Or had something else been at work? Something to do with the years of accumulation? The concentration of so many losses in one place? The presence of the wolf in the forest and whatever ancient power resided there? He didn't have time to puzzle it out. Because that night, when the wolf came, it brought nothing. Instead, it sat on Marcus's lawn and howled. The sound was like nothing Marcus had ever heard, not the howl of a normal wolf, but something deeper, older, resonant with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from an animal throat. It echoed off the trees and came back, changed, multiplied, until it seemed like 100 wolves were singing together. The voices in the forest rose to join it, and for the first time, Marcus could understand them. They were names, thousands of names, spoken over and over, each one a person who had been lost to the forest over the centuries. They filled the air like a swarm, overwhelming, infinite. A litany of the forgotten that had been building for longer than Marcus could comprehend. And with the names came the shadows. Not dozens this time, but hundreds, maybe thousands, emerging from the forest in a silent procession. They filled Marcus's fields, his yard, pressed up against his house until he couldn't see the ground anymore for the mass of them. The faded and the recent and the bound, all coming at once, drawn by the wolf's call. Marcus stepped out onto his porch, his heart hammering. The wolf was at the front of the crowd, and it was looking at him with an expression that could only be called expectant. Behind it, the sea of shadows waited. "I can't," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the chorus of names. "I can't help all of you. I don't even know how I helped her. I don't know what I'm doing." The wolf cocked its head, then did something it had never done before. It changed. The transformation was fluid, impossible, like watching reality rewrite itself. The wolf's form stretched and shifted, becoming taller, more upright, until a man stood where the beast had been, if man was the right word. He was tall and thin, dressed in clothes that seemed to be made of shadow and moonlight, with hair that might have been black or might have been the absence of color. His eyes were still golden, still ancient, still inhuman. "You do know," the figure said, his voice the same resonant quality as the wolf's howl. "Your grandfather knew. All the Hartleys have known, even if they couldn't articulate it. You are the witness, the keeper, the one who stands between the forest's memory and the world's forgetting. By acknowledging loss, you give it form. By giving it form, you make it possible to release. The objects are anchors, yes, but they are also keys. When the story is fully witnessed, fully understood, fully grieved, the key turns and the door opens." "But I can't witness thousands of stories," Marcus protested. "It would take lifetimes, multiple lifetimes." "Yes," the wolfman agreed, "which is why there has always been a keeper, one after another, generation after generation. The work is never finished, but it must be done." "Why?" Marcus demanded. "Why must it be done? What happens if it isn't?" The figure gestured at the sea of shadows. "Look at them, really look. What do you see?" Marcus looked, and now that the figure had directed his attention, he could see what he'd been missing. The shadows weren't just standing there, they were in pain. Not the sharp pain of injury, but the deep grinding pain of existence without purpose, time without end, an eternal waiting that had no prospect of resolution. They were trapped, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead, unable to move forward because some part of them, the part tied to their anchors, remained behind. "The forest remembers everything," the wolfman said. "That is its nature, its purpose, perhaps even its curse. But memory without release is torture. These souls deserve to move on. They deserve to find peace, or rebirth, or oblivion, or whatever lies beyond death. But they cannot while they remain chained to their losses. You and your family have been giving them that release, one soul at a time, for 200 years. 200 years. Marcus felt dizzy. The Hartleys have only been here for 6 generations. 6 generations of Hartleys, the figure corrected, but before them, others, different names, different faces, but always someone willing to stand as witness. The forest chooses its keepers carefully. It chose you, Marcus. The moment you inherited this land, it would have chosen you even if you'd refused the inheritance. Eventually, this is your purpose. Your burden, yes, but also your gift. How many people live and die without ever knowing why they existed? You know, your work matters in ways most humans cannot imagine. Marcus wanted to argue, to refuse, to run, but he thought of the Shadow Woman who had finally been able to leave, to find her daughter. He thought of his grandfather's journals, the quiet pride in the duty fulfilled. He thought of the town's unspoken gratitude, the relief in their eyes when he could confirm their losses. He thought of Sarah, the little girl with one shoe. She was out there in the crowd somewhere, still waiting after 70 years. I don't know if I can do this, Marcus said, but I'll try. The wolfman smiled, a strange expression on his inhuman face. That is all anyone can do. Your grandfather tried. He succeeded more than he knew. You will too. In time, he began to change back, flowing from man shape to wolf shape. I will continue to bring what the forest yields. You will continue to witness. And slowly, over years and decades, the burden will lighten. Not disappear, it never disappears, but become bearable. This is the way it has always been. The wolf shook itself, then looked up at Marcus one more time. One more thing. The objects you have, free the bear, and others that will follow, destroy them, burn them, bury them, throw them in the river. Once they are released from their burden, they should not remain. Only the anchors that still bind should be kept. Then the wolf turned and walked into the crowd of shadows. They parted for it like water, and it led them back into the forest, a shepherd guiding its impossible flock. Marcus watched until the last shadow had disappeared among the trees. He went inside and built a fire in his fireplace, the first fire he'd lit since moving in, since the cold had made such things seem redundant. He placed the teddy bear in the flames and watched it burn. As it did, he felt something shift in the house, a lightening of the atmosphere, as if a burden he hadn't fully recognized had been lifted. The work continued. Night after night, object after object, story after story. Marcus developed a rhythm, a technique. He would hold each new object and open himself to its story. Not just passively receiving, but actively seeking, asking questions of the impressions and emotions he felt. Who were you? What happened? What are you waiting for? What do you need to be free? Sometimes the answers came easily, sometimes they took days or weeks of patient attention, and sometimes, for the bound, they required more. Marcus started making trips to the town library, researching old newspaper articles and death records, trying to find the details that would complete the stories. He tracked down descendants when he could, learning family histories that filled in the gaps. He visited graves, reading headstones, noting dates and names that matched the impressions from the objects. The town helped, once they understood what he was doing, or as much as they could understand. The librarian started setting aside old records she thought might be relevant. The Historical Society opened their archives to him. Elderly residents shared stories their grandparents had told them, pieces of oral history that had never been written down. And slowly, object by object, Marcus began to free them. A pocket knife that had belonged to a hunter who died in 1923. Marcus found his grandson, a man in his 70s, and let him hold the knife one last time while Marcus told him the story he'd felt in the metal. The old man wept and thanked him, and that night when Marcus held the knife again, it was lighter, ready to be released. A bracelet from 1889, worn by a young woman who died in childbirth. Marcus visited her grave, which had been forgotten and overgrown, and spent a day cleaning it, placing flowers, reading her name aloud. That night, her shadow came to him, smiled, and left through that invisible door, and the bracelet could burn. A toy soldier from World War I, carried by a young man who'd lied about his age to enlist and never came home. Marcus contacted a military historian, learned the soldier's regiment and fate, and arranged for his name to be added to the town's war memorial. The toy went into the fire, finally free. Not all could be freed. Some stories were too incomplete, the details too lost to time. Some shadows were too damaged by their long waiting, too fragmented to respond to witnessing, and some losses were so profound, so absolute, that no amount of acknowledgement could ease them. These objects remained in Marcus's collection, and their shadows remained in the forest, and Marcus learned to accept that he couldn't save everyone, but he could try. He could stand as witness, night after night, year after year, giving the lost what comfort he could. Seasons turned into years. Marcus's hair began to gray at the temples. Lines appeared at the corners of his eyes. He became what his grandfather had been, a quiet man, given to long silences. Respected by the town in ways that were never quite articulated. Children were warned not to disturb him. Adults nodded gravely when they passed him on the street. He was the keeper, the witness, the one who stood between. And each night, the wolf came, bringing what the forest remembered. Marcus would receive it, witness it, and when possible, release it. The collection in his house and barn grew and shrank, objects coming and going like the tide, the truly freed ones returning to ash and dust while the bound remained, waiting for their moment. The voices in the forest never stopped, but their character changed over the years. They became less urgent, less anguished, not happy. Happiness was not possible for the lost, but less burdened, as if the simple knowledge that someone was listening, someone was trying, someone cared enough to remember, made the waiting more bearable. One night, 20 years after the wolf had first appeared to him, Marcus stood on his porch and realized he was content. Not happy he had seen too much sorrow for easy happiness, but content. He had found his purpose. He had done work that mattered. He had eased suffering where he could and witnessed it where he couldn't. The wolf was sitting on his lawn, as it had been thousands of nights before. Marcus went down and sat beside it, leaning against its massive, cold flank. The wolf didn't move, just continued its eternal vigil, watching the forest and the house and the boundary between life and death. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, "for choosing me, for trusting me with this." The wolf turned its golden eyes to him, and for just a moment, Marcus saw something in them that might have been warmth. Then it turned back to its watching. They sat together in the darkness, the keeper and his companion, while the voices sang their endless chorus and the shadows waited with patient hope for their stories to be finally, fully, completely told. And each night after that, for the rest of Marcus's life, the wolf came bearing what the forest remembered, what no living thing should have to carry but that the dead could not release alone. And Marcus received each burden with careful hands and a willing heart, knowing that this was his duty, his purpose, his gift. He was the witness, and he would stand watch until his own story was complete and another took his place, as it had always been, as it would always be, for as long as the forest remembered and the lost needed someone to help them find their way home. The work was never finished, but it was good work, and it was his. In the forest, among the ancient trees, the voices sing they have always sung. They will always sing, but now, they sing a little lighter, knowing someone is listening, knowing someone cares, knowing that even the lost can eventually be found, if only someone is willing to stand as witness to their sorrow and their hope. The wolf walks its eternal rounds, gathering what the forest yields, bringing it to the keeper who waits in the house at the boundary between the living and the dead. And the work continues, generation after generation, one story at a time, one freed soul at a time, one small act of remembrance at a time, until every voice has been heard, until every loss has been witnessed, until every chain has been broken and every door has been opened and every shadow has found its way home forever.